Evening, everybody, and welcome. Nice to meet you all, sort of virtually tonight. And I was just saying to Philip, it's quite nice doing it on a bright evening because normally I'm used to doing this in sort of December, January time with artificial lights. It's nice to be doing this with some natural light. So I'm just going to share my screen to bring on the presentation. It's going to help tell tonight's story. So hopefully you can all see this. I'm just going to go from the beginning. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I've been studying peregrines now for over 20 years. I started studying peregrines back in 1998 as a student. I went to University of Bristol, and I grew up in Surrey, where we didn't have any urban peregrines. And suddenly in Bristol, there were urban peregrines using a big tall tower block in Bristol, and they still use that today, different birds, of course. And my fascination with them began partly with their food, because I was fascinated by what they were eating and started to discover interesting things about that. And then also started to put colorings on the birds, like this bird you can see in this picture, which has helped us actually look at where peregrines go when they leave their nest, and revealed that actually many of them head up your way, up into the Midlands, before perhaps carrying on even further north to look for free territories. So tonight's presentation really is going to be all about urban peregrines. It's going to be talking a bit about both the colouring side of it, what we found, about their behaviour. We're going to talk a little bit about the Leamington Spa birds, in particular the female, because she's a bird that we know where she came from, where she was hatched. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about their prey. And in each of the sort of two halves, we're not going to have a break, but in each of sort of roughly sort of 50-minute talk or so, we'll have a little poll as well. The first poll I'll do probably in about 10 minutes or so to do with the speed of peregrines, and then the second half something to do with their prey. So hopefully that's going to work all right, and it'll be a chance for you with your mouse just to be able to click on the particular answer you think that it is. And as Philippa says, we'll do some Q&As at the end. If you do have some questions along the way, you can pop them in the chat. And if I do have the chance to see it and incorporate it into what I'm saying, then I will do. If not, I'll cover it right at the very end. So here we have a wild peregrine. This is not a falconry bird. This is not a bird on someone's hand. This is actually a wild peregrine on an industrial building in the Netherlands. And it's a bird that actually is just kind of screeching really at the person that's going up to check the nest under a license. And for me, really, it sums up a peregrine falcon. Those big, wide eyes, which help them to actually see in quite dull, dark conditions. That black head, which is thought to help absorb some of the rays of the sunshine, acts a bit like a sort of sun visor so that they don't get too much reflection going into their eyes. And that hooked beak that's almost got like a double hook, the tomial tooth just here in the middle there, that helps them to kill their prey. And then that yellow skin that surrounds the eyes and also around the beak. And to produce yellow skin like that, you have to be eating very well. You have to be healthy, because birds can only get colour like yellow and red and orange from their diet. So that yellow around the eyes and the beak is a really good indicator to other birds, other peregrines, of the health of each other. And the brighter that yellow, then the healthier the bird is, the fact that it's obviously feeding very well. And just a short mention really about peregrine numbers, just to sort of reflect on the fact that while we do actually have lots of peregrines in certainly central and southern England at the moment, it hasn't always been that way. And if we go back 60 years or so, we only had just under 400 pairs. Now we have just over 1,700, perhaps a little bit higher, maybe a bit lower than that. And the reason for this decline and then increase is because peregrines suffered from illegal persecution, being shot, poisoned, but also in particular, they suffered, like otters and grey herons and other birds of prey, from the effects of pesticides being used in the countryside, DDT and their derivatives. And those cause peregrines to die, but also accumulated in their fatty tissues and then became sort of put into the eggs of the birds, and also caused them to lay very thin eggs that broke under their weight. So for many years, peregrines weren't successfully able to actually rear any chicks. Enough did though, and it's those birds that we see now coming through in the numbers that we have. Now, if we look at this map of peregrines, you'll see there's lots of triangles here, and all the upward pointing triangles, which are red, show you where peregrines have actually been increasing their range since the 1960s, and the downward grey triangles show you where they've actually been decreasing. So while peregrines are generally doing very well across the United Kingdom, there are places, particularly in Northern England and Scotland, where actually the numbers are going down. We'll explore why in a moment. But actually, on the whole, across most of England and parts of Wales and Ireland, you can see that actually peregrines are increasing and spreading out. Now, don't worry too much about this graph, apart from the fact that along the bottom you have the year since the mid 90s, and then you have this kind of line in the middle at 100, which is a kind of like standard index number. And you can see that actually across England, peregrine numbers have been going up. There was a particular bulge in their numbers during the noughties, and their numbers have gone down a little bit, and they'll probably go up again, which is a sort of standard kind of up and down as perhaps the peregrines are going up, and then their numbers get too high in relation to the amount of prey there is to feed on, and then numbers go down and then they go up. But if we look at the UK as a whole, we can see that since the mid 90s, actually peregrine numbers have actually dipped. And that's because, as we showed you, or I showed you in that map earlier on, peregrine numbers in some parts of the British Isles are going down. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of that is because of this habitat you can see here. This is an intensively managed moorland habitat. And where it's intensively managed, that can sometimes mean that there just isn't the prey. There's basically the habitat, although it might be good for red grouse and wading birds, some wading birds, it may not necessarily be good for everything. But also in these particular kind of grouse moorland habitats, you get lots of illegal persecution, like this dead peregrine down on the picture there. So in these kind of habitats, we're seeing illegal persecution. We might be seeing conflicts with racing pigeon fanciers, where some might illegally perhaps kill peregrines, but also perhaps more of an impact, I guess, across the whole of the UK is the fact that there's declining kind of prey species. So these are for Scotland. These numbers here, these percentages, are over the last sort of 30 or 40 years or so, based on people going out and doing surveys of these birds. There's half the number of lapwings, there's 10% less golden plovers, and 10% and similar for skylark and meadowpipit. So there's generally less prey for peregrines in some of these very remote areas. And there's also evidence that with our changing climate, these very wetter, colder springs that we've been seeing in Scotland particularly are perhaps also meaning that the chicks don't survive so well. Whereas down here in the sort of central southern areas, they're not doing too badly. Well, despite the fact that there are parts of the UK where they may not be doing so well, generally in the southern and central and northern parts of England, in urban areas, they are certainly doing very well indeed. That's because there's lots of prey. That's because there's lots of places for them to actually nest. Although we are starting to see more conflicts between these birds, we're starting to see much more interactions between established pairs and other birds that are coming in to take a look and thinking, I like this nest site, and actually fighting and trying to take over nest sites, often while there's eggs and chicks already actually in the nest place. So this beautiful photograph here shows us one of the birds, one of the females from Bristol, taken by a friend, Sam Hobson, who's a wildlife photographer, award-winning wildlife photographer. Beautiful, beautiful shot there, showing you those long pointy wings, those yellow legs there, the relatively short squared off tail. If you see something like a kestrel or a hobby, the tail looks much longer in proportion to the size of the body, and this very big, chunky, wide body there of the adult peregrine falcon. And the great thing about doing this talk right now at the start of May is this is what is happening at many, many locations across the UK, particularly in urban locations and also now in rural locations. We're getting hatching happening. And hatching happens over a sometimes reasonably small window, but this year we have some birds, for example, in London that are almost 3 weeks old, and we have some that are literally only just hatched in the last day or so. These three little cute chicks here have just hatched in the Avon Gorge in Bristol a few years ago. You can see the little white dot on top of their beak, which is their egg tooth that helps them actually get out of the eggs. And they're just very, very small and slight and fluffy. And over a couple of weeks or so, they do actually develop a much thicker whitish grey kind of down. And when they do become juvenile birds after about 6 weeks or so, this is what they look like. So quite different to the adult bird. They have bluish grey skin around the eye and the beak. They have streaks that kind of go down the body rather than across the body. And they're overall a much darker brown and creamier coloured bird. This one here is in the Avon Gorge in Bristol. giving us that kind of sense of crossover between the urban landscape and the rural landscape of the Avon Gorge. And what I want to share with you, I guess, really is the fact that over 14 years now, actually, I've been colouring in peregrines along with a team of other people. This person holding the bird here is Hamish Smith, who I've trained up to ring peregrines. And when they're 3 weeks old, you can, under a special Schedule 1 licence, visit the nest sites and actually put rings on these birds. Now, if you look at this bird here, you can see on the left leg, it's got a colour ring, TL in this case, and on the right leg, it's got a metal ring. The metal ring is one that we have to put on the bird by law. If we are doing ringing, it's got a special unique 6-digit code. And the one on the left-hand leg there is a ring that can be photographed from a distance. It can be seen through a telescope. It's a really good colour ring that people can detect and see, members of the public, and then report. This bird here is about 3 weeks old, showing you the fluff there, but some of the darker feathers just starting to come through on the head. And actually, this is the same bird in the Avon Gorge a couple of weeks later, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks later. So quite a transformation from 3 weeks old to sort of 6 or 7 weeks old, when those wing feathers are almost fully grown. You can just see on the tail feathers there, just some little tufts from the down that this bird had. But very much a fine bird indeed. They're flying around looking very strong. This is a female bird. And the female peregrines are much bigger than the male. So when you're watching, for example, the Leamington spar pair, you will see that when the male is bringing in food, and he will do a lot of the provisioning of the food in the first week or two of the chicks hatching, you'll see that he's a dinky kind of in comparison to the female. He's much smaller, 2/3 the size of the female. This allows him to catch a variety of small bird prey, which is very useful, particularly when the chicks are small. They don't need particularly big prey. And then the female will start to take more time away from the chicks after a few weeks, and she'll start bringing in even bigger prey, more sort of pigeons, for example. And the fabulous thing about birds in urban locations, for example, on the bell tower in the middle of Leamington Spa, is that it gives you the chance to see lots of behaviours that you wouldn't normally see. For example, this is a pair mating on a tower block in the middle of Bristol. And previously, really up until the sort of 1990s, many observations of peregrines was often at a distance, often through telescopes, and some of those intimacies of peregrine life at the nest were very much unknown. Maybe they were known more from sort of captive falconry birds, but a lot of this behavior we're seeing now on web cameras would have gone unnoticed, because we simply didn't have that way of getting that close to the birds without disturbing them. So a lot of web cameras now that we have across the country, including Leamington Spa, give us the chance to see into these birds' lives in ways that perhaps they didn't in the past. And there's now probably, I think there's about 30 plus different web cameras, some of them with live cameras, some of them where people haven't been able to get it onto the internet, but they give updates on Twitter and Facebook. And I remember 20 years ago when we used to have these little kind of grainy webcam images that were uploaded every 30 seconds or every minute. And now 20 years later, we have these sort of high definition cameras giving us really fabulous footage online. And it's really quite remarkable, that transformation. As you can see here, this bird is very happy amongst the urban location. Many of the buildings they use are churches and cathedrals that kind of replicate those cliffs and quarries that they like to habit and use. But equally, this bird seems quite happy just being amongst all this sort of urban junk of TV aerials and mobile phone masts that you can see here. And this is one of my favourite photographs, because this kind of sums up an urban peregrine. This was taken actually on Derby Cathedral some years ago now. Here's the male peregrine perched on a gargoyle, a person just walking below, but actually the bird here is in his own element. He can take off after prey if he wants to catch them. This is where he might bring his prey back to eat and pluck the remains of which fall below. And that's how I can study what the peregrines eat. But it's very much the peregrine's domain up here. And I know this is a male because he's very slight. He's got quite a small head. If this was a female, she just genuinely would look much bigger and bulkier. And you sort of start to get to know after a while when a bird looks like a male or a female. Although there are times when someone sends me a photograph of a bird on its own, and it's not always completely easy. Now, one of the reasons why we have lots of peregrines in urban areas is because actually when peregrines started to recover, when these pesticides were banned in the 1980s and peregrines started to recover from the effects of these chemicals, peregrines started to come back to rural locations. They then started to come back to quarry locations, but in a way they never had done before. They started to come into urban locations. And in many cases, peregrines have set up home on churches and cathedrals. They've shown a real interest in the building. They've started mating, but they haven't always had somewhere to actually lay their eggs. And in some cases, they may actually have laid those eggs into the gutters or into the lead roofing and rolled away and not been successful. So in the right place, in the right setting where there's already birds in residence, sometimes putting up a nest box like this can actually help the peregrines to actually lay those eggs and be successful. And certainly it's the placing of some of these nest boxes like in Leamington Spa that has indeed helped these birds perhaps be as successful as they are. There are conflicts with putting nest boxes up, and in some parts of London it doesn't always work. It can cause problems if the building's going to be demolished or if it's on a residential block, for example. And also there can be a conflict sometimes with racing pigeon fancies if the box is put up in a location where there aren't already peregrines in residence. There's more of an acceptance of them being put in place if the birds are already there and choosing to be there on their own accord. Anyway, this, for example, is a little baby bird, a little baby peregrine with an egg that hadn't quite hatched, but that did hatch in Bristol last year. And this is actually on a sort of natural ledge in the sense it's on a building. It's on a sandstone ledge, but over time that sandstone ledge has got soil on it, and that has grown grass and other plants, and it's developed actually into a really good nest site for the peregrines. And this chick literally had only just hatched. You can see the dinky little talons here, which at this point are not really killing machines. Very fluffy indeed. And at this stage, they have lots of yolk still inside their tummy. So even if they don't get fed immediately, people often worry that the peregrines don't feed their chicks as soon as they hatch. And actually, for the first 24 hours, they don't necessarily need much food. They actually have got yolk still inside that they'll be absorbing back in to grow. But the peregrines usually do start feeding them very quickly, actually. And just as an aside, this feather on the right-hand side, this long, dark black sooty feather, is actually a swift feather that the peregrines took this time last year. And this feather down at the bottom here, just to the right of the egg, is actually a starling feather there. All right. Before I carry on, I'm just going to stop talking for a moment and we're going to do our first poll, because one of the reasons why peregrines are well known is because of their speed. And the poll that I've got has got 3 different speeds that I'd like you to choose from in terms of how fast these birds are able to fly with these long pointy wings that you can see in this photograph here. So just as a little pause from me talking, let's see if this is going to work. We've got a poll here that should bring up a question about how fast the peregrine flies, and then 3 different speeds for you to choose from. Great. So if you grab your mouse and click on one of these, and we'll talk a little bit about the numbers that are actually here. So have a little go at what you think. Does it fly up to 80 miles per hour? Does it fly up to 150 miles per hour? Or do peregrines fly up to and over 200 miles per hour? And when we stop in a moment, Philippa should be able to end the polling, and then it will actually bring up the results. That looks like most people, I think. All right, so if we end that. Brilliant. All right, so a few of you there, one of you there saying up to 80 miles an hour, 30 of you saying up to 150 miles an hour, and 34 of you, 71%, saying over 200 miles an hour. Well, it is capable of flying over 200 miles an hour, believe it or not. And experimentally, perhaps, even closer to 250 miles an hour. And when they do that, it's often maybe just for milliseconds. When they go into this stoop dive, they put their wings back and they literally drop like a bullet through the sky for a moment to be able to glance their prey, such as a duck or a pigeon, before coming back to catch it. However, the other 2 speeds are still important. They probably generally fly at 100, 150 miles per hour when they're doing the stoop dive. It's just the fact that on some occasions they can go faster. And generally when they're flying around, they're probably flying between 60 and 80 miles per hour, similar speeds to swifts and eyed ducks and other birds like that. So brilliant. That worked very well. Okay. So I think if we do that, that should be all right. So back to the peregrines then, nest boxes and chicks. So this box here is actually on a building in Cheltenham. The chicks here are about 2 weeks old to, yep, just getting on towards 3 weeks old or so. And you can see the parent here just sheltering them a bit from the sunshine. But this is what's been successful here at Cheltenham. Previously, the eggs were running actually into the gutter. So a bit of colouring involved here. So as I mentioned, at 3 weeks old, we put colourings on these chicks. We work very closely with the British Mountaineering Council to go down to more rural nests. And in urban locations, we can often get access very easily. And these are the colourings we put on. This is DF. She ended up going up towards Tewkesbury Abbey and then ended up nesting in a quarry in Shropshire, all because we know who she was by her colour ring. Now, most of you watching this, if you've been watching the web cameras, you will know this bird very well, because believe it or not, this is the breeding female, the current breeding female at Leamington Spa. And here she is in 2012 at 3 weeks old. So the female that is on the nest with the chicks at the moment at Leamington Spa, this is her as a 3-week-old chick herself. Now, she lost her colour ring somehow, but she does still have a metal ring on. And back in 2018, the web cameras were able to sort of zoom in on the ring, and the volunteers were able to actually read the metal ring of the bird, and we were able to work out who she was. And she originates from Bristol, or just between Bristol and Bath. She's actually from a location which is on a cliff site, just above the railway, the main railway between Bristol and Bath, and that's where she was reared. And then she dispersed and came up to Leamington Spa. And here she is now. So here's a lovely picture of her looking directly at the photographer there, looking quite different to how she did back then. And if you look in this photograph, you can see there on her right leg, she's got the metal ring, but she's no longer got that colouring on her left leg. So most of them do actually keep that colour ring, but sometimes they do lose it. But this photograph here shows you how forward-facing those eyes are as a predator, and those dark, almost what we call moustachial stripes, they're coming down the face. Very, very distinctive of this bird. And look how pointed her wings are there for flying incredibly fast. And another picture here just showing you those pointy wings. And this is a picture of her coming in with some prey. So I mentioned to you about the fact that the male birds are potentially getting smaller birds like starlings, but she's a big bird and she's capable of carrying a pigeon very similar to her own sort of bulk, really. Well, a female peregrine is about 1 kilogram or 800 grams. A pigeon like this is about 300 grams. So it's a lot lighter and definitely under half her weight. But nonetheless, quite a task bringing this bird in. So some brilliant stuff there with the Leamington Spa birds, and you know, some of the stories I'm telling you here are very much sort of relevant really to what's going on at Leamington Spa at the moment. This is another young bird that I ringed actually here in the Forest of Dean where I live, and you can see here the bulging a bit above the head, and that's not a growth or anything. That's actually where the crop. It's a storage organ where when the bird feeds, it gets stored in the crop first before then going down into the stomach. So it's always nice to be ringing the birds when they've got a full crop, because you know that they've just been fed and actually that they're going to be very happy for a while, probably very sleepy for a while they are digesting that food. So if we go back a little bit in time, back to this colour ringing project, this is actually the first 2 peregrines that I ringed back in 2007. AA on the left was a male and AB on the right was a female, the very first birds. And now we've ringed over 300 peregrine chicks and heard back from around about 60 of them. One of the first peregrines that I ringed was AA. He was the first bird here on the left. That's him as a chick. And this is him as an adult bird. And he lived for 13 years. He disappeared after the breeding season last year. So he had 12 breeding seasons, I think, which is a pretty good age. They can live up to sort of 17 years or more. There's a bird in Scotland that's currently around about 23 years old. But actually getting up to about 13, 14-year-olds was pretty good going. And the great thing about this colouring is we have stories. So we know, for example, where the Leamington Spa bird came from. We know that she came from Bristol back in 2012. So we know that she's almost getting on towards 10 years old now herself. And these are 2 other examples here. So we've got JN and JY. They were both ringed. One was ringed in Bath, one was ringed in Exeter in 2015. And this is them on the left-hand side now. And they are a breeding pair in Taunton. And they are pretty much, with these blue colorings, our first known breeding pair, where we know exactly where the mum comes from and exactly where the dad comes from. And when they first nested, actually in 2018, they did it all a little bit kind of wrong, really. And this is quite typical of birds that are only a couple of years old. So they actually laid their first egg on their cache, and their cache is where they sort of do all the plucking of their prey. So it's a bit manky. Perhaps not unexpectedly, the egg actually disappeared, and they did actually properly nest in the nest box. And you can see down here on the bottom here, this Taunton pair in their first year feeding the chick, and then when it was a lot older and looking very teenage-like, it was then actually being fed all by itself. So it got lots of food there. And in subsequent years, they've been taken to the box. And since having ringed a lot of these peregrines now, we've had them go all over the country. We had one go from Exeter to Halifax. We had one go from the Dorset coast up to near Derby. We've had several birds head over towards Suffolk, and actually the breeding female at Norwich. So if any of you are following the Hawk and Owl Trust's camera at Norwich, that breeding female comes from Bath. And she originally caused a lot of mayhem when she first appeared, because she actually booted out the breeding female. While there were chicks, the male carried on feeding those 4 chicks, and then as those chicks fled, she gradually booted them out and killed some of those chicks as well. And then subsequently, she then nested herself in other years following that, and is now the breeding female. In Nottingham, not my colourings, but other people's colouring. In Nottingham, the breeding male is originally from London. The female, who laid 2 eggs this year, she then died. We think she perhaps hit a window. And then within a day or so, he was then joined by a new female, also from London, who happens to be his niece. So the male and female at Nottingham are related. The female quickly got it on with the male and laid 2 eggs, and they've been incubating 4 eggs, the dead female's 2 eggs and her own eggs, and they've just started to hatch. I think it's probably just the new female's eggs that have hatched, because the older female's eggs were often left overnight and probably went cold once the chicks had started developing. But anyway, hopefully it just shows you the range of distances here. Generally, these long distances are female birds, often traveling over 100 miles, and the smaller distances tend to be the male birds. So male peregrines don't move very far from where they hatched, 15, 20, 30 miles, sometimes more, whereas the females will often go over 80, 100, 150 miles. And that's to avoid inbreeding generally. Doesn't always work. As with the male and the female in Nottingham, they are related, but generally it's a way in which the males disperse short distances and set up territories, and then the females go searching for males in those territories. So this, for example, is the Dorset coast. This is where we have one bird who then actually disappeared up to Belper near Derby. He lasted, I think, about 6 or 7 years. He sadly hit something last year and was found dead, but he did very well indeed. This was him here, CK. And interesting enough, actually, he also moved into this location when the previous male had died, and he literally turned up within about a day or 2 and was already sort of mating with the female and breeding. So these peregrines there's not really much time in between one disappearing and a new peregrine coming back in. So often at urban locations, if a bird dies or disappears, people obviously get very upset, they get very worried, but actually, generally, the bird is replaced literally within a day or 2, and things just carry on if there's time. And this was him actually with a pigeon back in 2019. So as I say, he had his last breeding season last year. This was another example of a bird. This was DX, who we ringed in the Avon Gorge. And actually, this was DX, I think, that not DF, that went up to Tewkesbury. And sometimes when you read these rings on a camera, particularly the older cameras, you can't really read the rings very well. But fortunately, once you've got someone with a good camera, you can zoom in on that ring and you can actually then read the ring. And here she is actually feeding very well on Tewkesbury Abbey with a very full crop before she went off to breed in Shropshire. And this is another example of a bird on Worcester Cathedral. This is TA. This bird was ringed in the Avon Gorge in 2018. In Bath in 2018, and then seen the following March in Worcester at Worcester Cathedral. And you can see the TA showing up very well indeed on there. So hopefully your chicks in Leamington Spa will also be ringed this year. It's a really great way in which you can then identify these chicks, both once they've been ringed at 3 weeks old, but then also when they're out of the nest and you might be visiting the bell tower and seeing them around the building, but also when they actually leave the building as well and they get seen subsequently elsewhere. And it's a great way in which you, as people following these birds, can then know about the sort of life histories of what they actually get up to. So here's TA in Worcester, and here was TA actually as a baby when it was ringed in 2018. And here it is actually just about to fledge on the edge of the nest on the right-hand side there. So there's lots of other examples as well of these birds. This is CT. CT actually appeared on Springwatch in 2012 when Springwatch featured the Bath Peregrines. This is him in his first year, and he actually lost that colour ring, but the BBC cameras were able to zoom in on the metal ring and read the colour ring. And he actually then helped out mum and dad with rearing the chicks. So something that we are seeing more of now is that with lots more peregrines around, rather than the male peregrines in their first year choosing to move away, they often stay with mum and dad, help rear the chicks, learn a bit about growing up and rearing chicks and things like that before disappearing off and setting up their own territory. And this bird here was a bird actually that was ringed. This is SG, and this bird was ringed actually down on a cliff in Devon and then spotted last year feeding on a puffin actually on Stockholm Island. And interesting enough, this was a rural coastal bird actually on Stockholm Island. And we do tend to find that if a bird's been reared on a coastal cliff, it's very likely to nest on a coastal cliff. If a bird's been ringed in an urban area, it's very likely to return back to an urban area to breed. There's a little bit of overlap between urban birds becoming cliff nesters and cliff nesters becoming urban birds, but generally they tend to go back to what they've actually been, what they know. I can see there's a couple of questions here, by the way. I'll see if I can answer those in a moment before I switch on to prey in a moment. Now, the final story actually is this one here. So this is RY. This was a couple of years ago now in Taunton. And in the top right, you can see him actually quite happily feeding on a pigeon. But then sadly, on the bottom two pictures here, you'll see that there's a dead peregrine. But if you have a look on the water bottle here, you can see it's actually got some Arabic written here. It's not in Britain. It's not even in Europe. This male bird that was hatched in Taunton actually ended up in Morocco, of all places. And it travelled all the way down to Tiznit in Morocco. It was one of the most southerly recorded British peregrines. Only one other has been recorded on the Canary Islands. And it's really bizarre because, as I mentioned to you, male peregrines generally don't move very far. Scandinavian peregrines will often move to North Africa and parts of southern Europe. But that's because they're moving away because of the cold and because of the snow and the lack of prey. There's possibility that this bird was ship assisted, that part of its journey, it may have been on a ship, maybe across the Bay of Biscay. But nonetheless, still remarkable that this bird that was reared in Taunton was then subsequently found, possibly presumed hit by a car in Morocco. Really remarkable, and just shows you the value of putting these colour rings on these birds. All right, before we go on to talk about prey, just a couple of questions here that are answers we're going along. Someone was just talking about the stoop prey and how do they actually kill their prey? Is it the force of hitting them? Well, no, not always. So very often they do actually bring prey back alive. They often bring back live pigeons, live starlings, live prey at night. So that stoop dive, what it tends to do is it tends to stun their prey. If the peregrine was to go straight into the prey, 150, 200 miles per hour, it could actually cause quite an injury to itself. So it kind of comes down and glances the prey, sort of wins the prey, and then it will come back round again and actually grab it. Now, it depends what the bird's doing. If the peregrine is just flying low over the ground, it might grab something immediately, or if it's grabbing something by surprise. But generally, when it's doing a stoop dive, it's glancing and then quickly coming back to its prey, and they will use the beak generally with this extra kind of process on it, the tomial tooth, to actually kill the prey outright. And then someone else was asking about peregrines that recently were in rugby and they don't seem to be there anymore. That's quite common behavior. So even though I've said to you that there are lots of peregrines around, one thing that we are finding is that peregrines will still use churches and buildings, often just during the winter until April time. And then often they return in July, August. And this might be where the peregrines are moving off to breed elsewhere. and it may be in places where peregrines are still coming into the area. But it may also be that there just isn't somewhere suitable for them to lay their eggs. So we've seen a similar thing at a couple of other sites near Leicestershire, where there have been birds all winter. There's been some nest trays put up, but the birds haven't quite taken to them. So I suspect in Rugby that these are probably birds that are not breeding in Rugby, but are choosing to use the church during the winter months when there's perhaps lots of prey around. And these birds then have moved off. They've moved off maybe to more northern areas, or they've actually moved to a nest location that may be more suitable for them. So I wouldn't worry too much. I imagine they will be back in July, August time, and whether or not there's a nest tray there or not, they may or may not take to it. But this is quite common behaviour, particularly when the birds are starting to move into an area. It's quite common that they may not necessarily spend the whole year there. And we used to see a similar thing in Bath and Bristol 20 years ago. So don't worry, this is all sort of common behaviour. One more question there. Why doesn't the fourth egg often hatch? Well, it's quite possible that the fourth egg may have been the first egg to be originally laid. It may be infertile. It may be that the birds were just starting to mate and that the sperm didn't fertilize the egg inside. Or it may be that the birds have responded to the chicks by incubating the chicks and keeping them warm. And perhaps the egg has been ignored or something and gone cold. There's a variety of different reasons why the egg may not have hatched. All right, so for the last 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a bit more about these birds, what they eat, because they're very famous for their speed, and they're speedy because they need to be able to catch other birds. Peregrines, unlike kestrels, for example, feed on mainly birds. They sometimes feed on small mammals. They sometimes feed on small bats. Occasionally, they might feed on small rabbits, for example, around Stockholm and Scoma and Ramsey Island in Pembrokeshire. But generally, in urban locations, they're bird eaters. And this one here actually is feeding on a swift. And these are the sorts of things we can find. So when you do have a bird on a church, or for example on the bell tower in Leamington Spa, then very often below that building you can find the remains of pigeons, but lots of other birds as well. These stripy feathers are from teal duck. These feathers over here with these little white tips and orange bars, these are from a woodcock. This orangey barred feather here is from a snipe. This is a snipe feather here. And there's a yellow feather at the top here, which is greenfinch. So what we were able to do, and what I have been doing for the last 20 years, is collecting the prey remains, and I've had other people helping me as well. And I'm currently doing a part-time PhD now at the University of Bristol, and in collaboration with the University of Cardiff, and also working with some other people at King's College London, Brandon Mack. And we've got volunteers monitoring 20 web cameras, looking at what peregrines are bringing back to their nest locations. And John and the team are helping me in Leamington Spa by sending me images and photographs of the prey when they're being fed, and also in a way that I can identify what the prey is as well. So thank you, John and the team, for doing that. And I've also been collecting the prey remains, this sort of prey remains really, for over 130 locations in Britain to really look closely at what urban peregrines are really eating, because they don't necessarily just eat pigeons. And these, for example, are the typical kind of prey bags that I might get from Exeter, usually on a weekly basis. We've got a turnwing here and some goblet skulls and things like that. At the end of the day, they eat quite a variety of different prey. And here's an amazing photograph taken by Dave Pears in Cheltenham, where the adult bird is very delicately here feeding one of the young birds. Just a very remarkable, intimate shot. And here we've got our Y again that I showed you went to Morocco here, feeding on a pigeon. And indeed, pigeons are an important prey item for peregrines. They, in urban areas, they can make up about 2/3 of the diet. So the feral pigeon, along with some wood pigeons, some stock doves, some collared doves, do form an important part of the diet. But at other times of the year, other birds are also important. So in the autumn time, you might see redwings becoming important in the diet. Teal duck, for example, golden plovers and lapwings. And if we were in the London area and some of the home counties, you would find ringneck parakeets forming quite an important part of the diet. And with the webcam studies that I'm doing at the moment, we're trying to see how important the ringneck parakeet is in the diet of London peregrines. We tend to find that once the chicks get to about 2 or 3 weeks old, get a bit bigger, then more ring-necked parakeets start to come into the nest site along with feral pigeons, and so do seem to form quite an important part of the diet, particularly when they've got bigger young heading towards the fledging stage. And here's a picture actually of a peregrine in Newbury in Berkshire carrying a teal duck, just to sort of show you that kind of what it does actually look like when these birds are bringing this prey into these urban areas. So peregrines basically a huge variety of different prey items, and in Exeter, for example, we've recorded over 100 different prey items, which is really quite remarkable. But what is really interesting is that during the breeding season, they tend to rely just on a few species, feral pigeons and starlings mainly, perhaps the odd tit, the odd house sparrow, and the odd other bird. Down in Brighton and Chichester, they were also bringing things like terns and gulls. But generally, they're feeding on just a few species. And then in London and the home counties, they're also feeding on ring-necked parakeets. So it's very interesting that during the autumn and winter, they feed on a whole variety of different birds in the countryside. But with the young, they're focusing very much on the common, perhaps easier to catch. Well, pigeons aren't that easy to catch, but starlings and feral pigeons. But what is also very interesting, though, is what then happens at night. And this, for example, is on Worcester Cathedral, just showing you one of the birds, very active as it's starting to get dusk. These birds have got big eyes for seeing in the dark. They don't go to sleep necessarily, particularly during moonlit nights, and also in our towns and cities where we have lots of street lamps. And this is what they get up to. So, for example, this is in Taunton, and the peregrine falcon in the middle of the night here actually has a moorhen. And what we have discovered is that during the middle of the night, peregrines are bringing back migrating prey, such as moorhens, such as teal duck and woodcock, and migrating birds such as little grebes. So up until 20 years ago, we very much thought of the peregrine as our fastest bird in the world, this aerial daytime predator. But we've actually realized that it's also very much a nocturnal predator. We think using the light from street lamps that shines up into the night sky, it's illuminating the pale bellies of many of our water birds and migrating wading birds. And it's meaning that rather than stoop diving for these prey, the peregrines are hanging in the shadows. They're flying out very short distances, catching the prey, and then bringing it back to eat. And this is a peregrine in the middle of the night bringing back a teal duck, for example. I think we might have some footage here of a woodcock being brought in. And here, actually, the woodcock's still alive, believe it or not. So the peregrine has literally just caught this bird and brought it back. And although you might think, that's a bit cruel, but it's the way it works. The peregrine's just caught it. It will kill the bird in time and then obviously eat it. But crucially, what it has told us a lot about is the fact that the peregrines are indeed catching this bird at night. That woodcock was still alive. The peregrine had caught it and was bringing it back as soon as it had caught it. So we really learned a lot of remarkable behavior thanks to the quality of these cameras, which are actually giving this footage at night, for example. And this is indeed the remains of a woodcock actually taken in Dorchester earlier this year. So just quite remarkable. This one here is actually with an avocet. So as avocets are increasing in number, we're also seeing avocets turn up in the diet. And we can just see the long legs of the avocet here from Taunton. And this is the cache here of a peregrine nest site. There's woodcock in here. There's moorhen in here. So the birds tend to build up this cache and and come back. They almost use it as a bit like a sort of fridge freezer. So they come back on feeding these prey when other prey items aren't so easy to find. And so from these kind of nocturnal prey studies, we found really that birds like little grebes, woodcock, quail even, and water rail are taken in not like huge numbers, but they are taken regularly each autumn and also in the spring migration. And even birds like this, these brown feathers here are from corncrake, and these feathers here are from spotted crake. So these very secretive birds are very difficult for us to see. They migrate at night, and when they migrate at night, they become much, much more easy for birds like peregrines to actually catch. And so just to finish off with this prey side of things, really, we've got this kind of contrast between the birds stoop diving during the day, but then at night time, sitting in the shadows and flying up and catching their food. So when you're watching the Leamington Spa birds over the coming weeks as the chicks grow, you will see them bringing in lots of pigeons and starlings over the coming weeks. They may occasionally, excuse me, bring in the odd other prey, but generally it will be pigeons and starlings. And then as those birds fledge and as we start to go into midsummer, the prey will diversify again, as perhaps there's more birds flying over Leamington Spa, but also the birds might well be venturing more out into the countryside to feed on wading birds and gulls and things like that. So I hope that the last 50 minutes or so have given you a really nice insight into our urban peregrines. This is one that's looking right at the camera here, taken by Ken White in Newbury, and another one here in beautiful light there, just summing up an urban peregrine against this brickwork building in Newbury. And I hope that this evening really has given you more insights. Really, we started off very much just introducing the peregrine, talking about the fact that it's very much becoming widespread across the British Isles now, although showing some declines in Scotland and Northern England due to persecution and declining habitats and prey species. But we think it's doing really well in urban locations like Leamington Spa because there's lots of prey, there's nest sites for it, there's lots of other birds around. And so these birds are doing very well indeed. And as a result, there are web cameras, of course, and opportunities for us to follow these birds. If you go online now, there's lots of ways in which you can follow these birds, including, of course, the pair at Leamington Spa. And then in the last 20 minutes or so, I've been talking to you more about prey and hopefully just getting across that, yes, while pigeons are important in the diet of peregrines, there are other species that are also important and do influence their behavior. So in the autumn time, this switching to this nocturnal behavior is no doubt an important survival mechanism for peregrines to find prey that is migrating into the country. If you'd like to know more about urban peregrines, aside from hearing me speak tonight, I've got a book out that was published in 2014, all about urban peregrines and bringing together all these kind of nuggets of information that I knew was out there in scientific papers and out there in people's minds, but hadn't necessarily been put into one place. And so I've written this in an accessible way for non-scientists to read. So I hope that that's a book that some of you might well be interested in if you haven't already got that. And for those of you who are interested in prey remains, I've also had a book just recently published about peregrine, about identifying the prey remains and the most sort of common likely things you are to come across, for example, on the paths around Leamington Spa or in your garden once a sparrowhawk has been finishing off something that's been eating. So that book is also out there. And I shall finish off there. And I can see there's some more questions here in the chat, so I'm happy to answer those first and then hand over to anybody else who might have any questions. So if you're okay, Philip, I'll just go through a few of those questions. There was a peregrines on a block of flats in Coventry City last year, which have been demolished. Are the peregrines still around? Does anyone know? So I don't know about that. I know that peregrines have been using the central parts of Coventry for over 20 years. I had prey from them 20 years ago. There are still lots of places around Coventry for urban dwelling peregrines. So despite the fact those block of flats were knocked down, I wouldn't be surprised that there are still urban peregrines around in places. Someone else, they're talking about peregrines used to be were pair nesting on a hanger. Yeah, I think I know where you mean. Peregrines will often hang out on hangars along with kestrels, actually, in aerodromes and places like that. Someone talking about finding the remains of a green woodpecker in Warwick. Yes, so they will eat woodpeckers, actually. They'll often eat great spotted woodpeckers very frequently during the breeding season and also occasionally green woodpeckers. But fortunately, they don't ever eat lots of these birds. So even though some of these species I've mentioned might be of conservation concern, they're not eating them all the time. Well, they are with starlings, but there's still a lot of starlings around. But with some of these species like green woodpecker, corncrake, they're not eating that many of them, really. So the effects of predation will be relatively low from peregrines. Do you think night hunting is learnt from the parent birds? I don't think so. I think it's innate. We see night hunting happening all around the world, from parts of South America in Buenos Aires, for example, and Lima in Peru, to parts of Australia, to Bangladesh and parts of India, through to North America. We see night hunting happening everywhere. So we think it's probably an innate behavior that they probably do normally in response to moonlight. And they actually also do it in response to sort of street lamps and that kind of stimulus of birds being spotted as they're migrating overnight. Somebody asking, do you think peregrines pair for life? Well, no, they don't pair for life. And actually, female peregrines might have 3 or 4 partners during her lifetime and may shift location. And males may have 2 or 3 partners in his lifetime. So often when we talk about our pair of peregrines, they often are not. And they often switch around pairs, they often switch around partners, and they switch around sites. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also seeing quite a lot of rival birds, floating birds that are out there, also coming in and fighting with breeding birds and often being successful in taking over. Not always, but often. So the answer to that question is no, they don't mate for life. And they can often stay on territory for quite a number of years, like AA did in Bath for 13 years. And your bird, for example, she was ringed in 2012. She's been in Leamington Spa, I think, since 2016. So she's doing pretty well being there as long as she has done. But they don't pair for life. Do you have any idea where the offspring from the Leamington Spa pair have ended up? Really good question. So my predictions would be that young from Leamington Spa have headed north and probably northeast. So I wouldn't mind betting that Leamington Spa chicks have probably headed up into northern England, into Yorkshire, into Lancashire, maybe even to Scotland. But certainly they would have gone north, and that's because that's where the vacant territories are for these birds. And I know from ringing other birds that have been ringed around Derby, for example, that often these birds are being picked up slightly further north of where they were actually ringed. Just going through these questions here. What's a reasonable territory size? Is there a chance a pair could settle in Warwick, or is it too close? Nope, they could settle in Warwick. Generally around the Bristol area, we find they're about 2 miles apart from each other. But in Germany, there's evidence of them being able to nest 500 meters apart. There's 2 pairs that nested on a power station, and they couldn't see each other, and they were 500 meters apart. And where we start to get high densities of peregrines, they're often only a kilometre apart from each other. So yes, you could well get a pair even on the outskirts of Leamington Spa, but certainly you could get a pair in Warwick. And somebody did mention Warwick earlier, so there are certainly birds perhaps wintering in Warwick, even if they're not actually breeding. How big is a pair's territory? Well, it depends on where you are, what habitat you're in. If you're in an urban location like Coventry, then it's probably most of that town and parts of the countryside. If you're in somewhere like Scotland and a rocky crag on a mountain, it could be 20 miles square, because actually prey is much more sparsely distributed and you have to search much harder for it. But in somewhere like Leamington Spa and Warwick and Coventry, there's a lot more prey around, and so actually the territory may just be the size of the town and some of the outskirts that's on the outskirts of there. We know from a GPS tagged peregrine that we had in Salisbury, her territory was very much around the cathedral, and it went to the outskirts of the city of Salisbury, often along pylons that were often on the edge of agricultural land, but it did extend out into the perimeter of the sort of the countryside very close to the city of Salisbury. How are we doing for time? Oh, we're fine. Are bats a rare prey item? Well, they're not a common prey item, but many sites will record them once or twice a year. Often they feed on things like nocturnal bats and pipistrelle bats. But if we go to somewhere like Hungary and Germany, where bats are more common and there are more of them, and also nocturnal bats are migratory, then we find that bats are much, much more common in the diet. So less common in the British diet, probably because we've just got less bats and they're more at risk of decline in numbers. But where there are more of them in parts of Europe, we see urban peregrines taking quite a lot of them, actually, to be honest. How often do they need to hunt? And do they need a constant stream of food, or do they stay full for a while? Well, they only need a pigeon every other day or so. A pigeon that weighs about 300 grams provides enough flesh for a peregrine for a good couple of days. What they tend to do, though, is during the winter time and autumn times, they cache their food. So they might actually catch more than they need. They put it into different places on top of a building and they hide it away. And then if we get a snow event or a rainy event or something like that where prey is hard to catch or prey has disappeared, So often when it snows, birds like skylarks, golden plovers, lapwings disappear out. They head off to France for a few days. Then the peregrines have actually got a supply, a larder to feed on. But when they haven't got chicks, when you're watching these chicks at Leamington Spa, they might feed the chicks 6 to 8 times a day on little morsels. They might often bring out the same pigeon and feed the same pigeon to the chicks 3 or 4 times that day before it gets demolished. When those chicks are about 6 weeks old, they might well be feeding on the equivalent of 3 or 4 whole pigeons a day. So their food intake really changes once these chicks are 6 weeks old. But the adult birds themselves may only need to feed on the equivalent pigeon for a couple of days. You tend to find with the prey remains, if they haven't been feeding much on pigeons, they've been feeding on quite a lot of small birds to make up that similar amount of food. What's the weirdest prey item you've ever found? That's a really good question. What's the weirdest prey item? I don't know. I mean, obviously they will. I think sometimes it's maybe unexpected birds that you wouldn't expect to be taken. So sometimes they'll take storm-driven birds like Manx shearwater in an urban location, storm petrel, Leach's storm petrel, where those birds have perhaps been blown off course and the peregrines have found them. And sometimes they might take aviary birds like budgerigars and small parrots and things like that, which have escaped and don't necessarily know how to survive in the wild very easily. But I don't think we've had anything weirder than that. I've had pretty weird things with urban gulls. I've been on the roof of buildings in Bristol and found deer legs and the remains of things like weasels and moles on the tops of roofs with urban gulls. But I haven't really found anything too odd when it comes to peregrines. Could the rugby peregrines be encouraged to nest here if we put up a super nest box? Would that be an okay thing to do? So yeah, again, going back to earlier on, was that if there is a pair of peregrines already on site, then it's generally more acceptable that if a nest tray is put up and the birds are successful, that's okay. What I think is less acceptable to some members of the community is if the birds aren't already there and then a nest tray is put up, because you're then creating, for example, a conflict with racing pigeons and that sort of thing. But if the birds are already choosing to be there on that church, then putting a nest tray up can be an appropriate thing to do, and that's happened quite a lot this winter where new birds have turned up and there's been that real potential. What often happens, those nest boxes are often put up too late. One way or another, you have to go through talks and agreements with the building owners or the church. And so if an X-tray doesn't get put up till January, February time, that can sometimes be too late for that pair to breed. So sometimes it might need another full breeding cycle of the nest tray being in place before the birds take to it. And that happened in Bath back in 2000. The nest box went up and they didn't actually breed until the following year, and they've been pretty successful since then. How are we doing for time? Maybe a couple more questions. There's still quite a few more to go through. I'll have a little quick through. What's the most extreme habitat they've nested in? Well, I mean, in Britain, really, they can nest in everything from very rugged mountains in Scotland through to very hot pylons. Pylons are made out of metal, of course, and that metal can get very hot, searingly hot. So I would say extreme habitat is actually being on a metal pylon in the middle of the countryside on a hot summer's day. They will nest on the ground, in boglands, in Finland, for example, and occasionally on beaches in Britain, not very often. But they don't tend to like the desert areas. So deserts tend to be replaced by things like the Saker falcon. So although peregrines are found all around the world, you don't tend to see them in the very extreme Arctic areas. They're taken over by the gyre-falcon, and then desert areas they tend to be taken over by the Saker falcon, which is much better at dealing with those conditions. Someone asking about headless prey. Do they decapitate them? They do decapitate them, and sometimes they will eat the brains and the head because it's very nutritious. It's high in omega-3 fatty acids, just like bears will do the same with salmon. If you watch a natural history program, you'll see bears often eating the brains and leaving the rest of the salmon. So it's a similar thing with peregrines, that sometimes they will eat the head, but sometimes they just disregard it and just eat the flesh. So it depends maybe on how they're feeling in terms of hungry and things like that. I'll just quickly whip through some of these questions before handing back to Philippa. Does anything prey on peregrines? Yes, things like goshawks and eagle owls do. And in Maine and Europe, where eagle owls are increasing, there is a slight sort of conflict or equilibrium being made between eagle owls increasing and nesting in quarries that peregrines use, and those eagle owls actually eating peregrines. Do we know anything about the current male in Leamington? I don't think we do. He's not ringed, and if these birds aren't ringed, unfortunately, we don't know where they come from. What are the white sticks in the circle on the side of the chick's beak? Aha, good question, Benjamin. So if you look at the nostrils on this little peregrine here, it's got these little knobs here in the nostrils, and those are called baffles. And what they do is they help the peregrine when it's flying fast. It helps to stop the air going really quickly into the nostrils of the peregrine and causing it to damage. So if you were to fly through the sky really, really fast with your nostrils open, the air would be going into your nostrils really quickly and could cause damage to the inside of your nose and the blood vessels and what have you. And those little knobs there, they actually help to restrict the amount of air going into the nostrils. So that's a really good question there. Let's see if we can just do a couple more questions. Do they ever nest in trees? They do sometimes in Britain, in Belarus, in Poland and parts of Germany. There is a tree nesting population of peregrines. It's become quite fragmented with the effects of DDT, but yes, some do nest in trees, but not very much in Britain. Could the decline in Scotland be linked to increase in white-tailed eagles? No, absolutely not. White-tailed eagles don't prey on peregrines. They prey on fish and small mammals and things like that. We know that the decline in Scotland is due to poor habitat, declining prey species, and people illegally killing peregrines. And do peregrines ever take carrion birds? I've seen crows in a tussle with a bird of prey. Are they possibly any buzzards? So they do sometimes. Peregrines will sometimes eat crows, rooks, jackdaws, and magpies. Usually during the breeding season. So when jackdaws and rooks maybe are just leaving the nest, peregrines will often eat them then. I wouldn't say they take huge amounts of corvids, but they do take a lot more during the breeding season when the young corvids are just leaving their nest, and the peregrines can easily catch them. All right, great, brilliant. A fabulous set of questions there. I've done a few peregrine talks and usually get the odd question, but actually that's a really fabulous range of different questions. And I hope I've been able to answer those as well and quickly as possible in the time that we had. And I think that's a good moment to I'll stop sharing and hand back to Philippa.
Thank you very much, Ed. I hope everyone found that as fascinating as I did and learnt a lot in the last hour. If anybody does think of any more questions for Ed after this talk, feel free to email me and I will pass them on to Ed and
absolutely.
ask him to respond. I know it's quite difficult to come up with a question on the spot, so feel free to email me and I will pass them on. And please keep an eye on the webcam. It's very exciting at the moment. We are in the exciting period. So thank you everybody for attending and we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Ed. It's lovely to see you again.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
Hope to see you all at Peregrine Watch next year when we're allowed back out on the street.
I know, just when the peregrines will be fledging will just be when that next stage in June may or may, hopefully will happen.
Yeah. So if you're walking through Leamington, obviously remember to look up and keep your eyes out. But thank you very much, everybody.
All right. Yeah. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.